They were originally brought here in the early 1900s as a private operation to breed cattle and bison together to have a hardy animal that could be sold. That didn't work out, and eventually the Arizona Game and Fish Department bought the bison, and the Forest Service made an allotment for them out at House Rock Valley, and they were living there happily for many, many decades and being managed a herd of about 100 animals. But sometime in the late 1990s, some of the bison started to wander up to the north rim of the Grand Canyon and liked it there. They would go back and forth between House Rock and the Grand Canyon. And this is where House Rock Valley is. This is the park. But about 2009, they never went back to House Rock Valley. And so they found living was pretty good up at the north rim of the Grand Canyon. And the Arizona Game and Fish Department had hunts for bison outside of the park on the Forest Service land. And so they learned pretty quickly that when they were on the forest, they had the potential to be harvested. So they spent a majority of the time in the park. And this map just depicts, we see a lot of bison in this core area in the summertime. The wintertime, they're out at Powell Plateau, out on the rims. And just this past year, we had bison out here on the Walhalla, all the way down to here. That was a new thing that we picked up through our monitoring of the bison. And I just wanted to mention that we do have currently 8 GPS collars on bison on the north rim. They're collecting data every day, and we get to see that information on where they're moving, how they come together in different groups and break apart, where they're at seasonally and daily. And so we're going to be collecting a lot of information from here on out about what the bison are doing on the north rim. And I'll touch a little bit about some of the impacts we're seeing. The water, the veg, the soils, the cultural resources. And start off with the water. This is a photograph that was in the environmental assessment for the bison. And you can see a bit of a difference from kind of pre-bison to post-bison use. The vegetation is different, the color of the water is different. Some other examples, this is actually 2 different photographs. This is Little Park Lake on the north rim. And this is a place called Coffee Lake that the bison like to use, which is further inland. And at both of these spots, essentially they're drinking the water and they're going into the water. And I know at Coffee Lake in particular, they tend to basically drink all the water before, if they weren't there, the timing that the water would dry up. And there are some amphibians and different species in the Coffee Lake that we've noticed. One more example of the water, this is Fawn Spring, and the fencing around this was originally put in about 5 or 6 years ago to look at bison impacts to springs. So they fenced off an area that bison couldn't get into. There's water up above the fencing and it comes out down below. And the take-home message was, yeah, the bison are eating all the plants down to little nubbins, and they're drinking all the water that's coming out, and they're having impacts to the soil. So we're seeing a lot of that at all the different water sources. And we decided we would try and fence bison out of the water since we know they're having impacts. And you can see how successful we were here. Yeah, they found their way in pretty easily, so we're thinking about how we might be able to adjust our fencing to actually keep them out in the future. It was kind of a pilot project, and it didn't go very well for us. They didn't seem to really notice one way or the other. And here's a kind of a collage of some different soil impacts that we've seen. Bison love to wallow in the dirt, and they create these big bare patches, which are these top 2 photos and part of this. They've also developed a pretty intricate and well-worn system of pathways along the different drainages of the north rim that go, in particular, up to Little Park Meadow, which is right by the entrance station. And there's very wide and very well-used pathways that the bison are traveling back and forth, typically from water sources up to the meadows. And I thought this was pretty fascinating. This is a Google Earth image, a recent Google Earth image of a place called Cannabonitz, or Cannabowitz, depending on your preference. And you can actually see the bison wallows on the landscape in this satellite image. So, and this is just one small section of that valley. And of course, when they disturb the soil, it creates opportunities for invasive plants to come in, like woolly mullein and other ones. We're seeing some of that. And this is just a depiction of the lower part of the picture is an area where we have little to no bison use on the north rim. It's a secret spot. I won't tell them where it's at. And the top one is a spot that the bison use regularly. And I don't know about you, but looking at this picture, the plants on the bottom look a lot happier than the ones on the top. Just saying. And I won't, I realize the left part of this slide's a bit busy, but just to point out that there have been cultural resource impacts from the bison, and Ellen and her crew have been monitoring archaeological sites on the North Rim. And this column here is basically, if you have a 0, there haven't been bison there yet, and if you have a number, there have been bison there. There's 24 different sites, and about 15 of them had some degree of bison at the archaeological sites. And the photographs are just depicting bison hoof prints actually in artifact sites. And so, what are we going to do about the bison on the North Rim? And I believe I skipped the part about, I mentioned in the beginning there was 100 bison at House Rock Valley. Now we estimate there's 400 to 600 at Grand Canyon, and they normally reside almost entirely within the park. As I mentioned earlier, when the bison go outside of the park, meaning north onto the forest, they are available to be harvested through hunting. And the Arizona Game and Fish has kind of pushed up the hunting pressure, and they've been able to harvest a fair amount of bison every year, but it's still not enough to keep up with the growth rate of the population. One thing I've learned kind of getting into this bison management issue is that bison are really good at reproducing. And so they produce more calves than than Game and Fish can harvest outside of the park. So the population is going to continue to grow. And I did some modeling a few years back that indicated we could have 1,200 to 1,500 bison on the North Rim within the next decade. So we, meaning the Grand Canyon National Park, the Kaibab National Forest, and the Game and Fish have all agreed that we have too many bison on the North Rim, and we need to think about how we can effectively reduce that population and start to reverse some of the impacts that we're seeing in the park itself. And so we produced this document last year. It's an environmental assessment to talk about some of the options we might think about to reduce the population. And it really came down to two things. One is to corral the bison and ship them off the park live. And we're working with an entity called the Intertribal Buffalo Council. And that's what their agency does essentially, is take bison from federal lands and give them to Native American tribes throughout the country. So we have a resource where an avenue where we can take live bison from Grand Canyon and take them off the park, never to return. And they'll live their lives out on a reservation or a piece of land happily ever after. The other option we've discussed that's in the EA is actually using lethal culling and shooting the bison within the park to try and reduce the population. And not only is it a way to reduce the numbers, but also a way to make the bison feel uncomfortable on the park, because the situation as it exists currently, the bison are really comfortable in the park because they don't have anything to scare them out of the park. And there's places, due to the nature of traveling on the North Rim, a lot of it's designated wilderness. There's only one paved road, there's a couple dirt roads. We don't really practically have the means to build corrals other than one spot. And so we've talked about having the lethal culling be part of removing the bison in the more remote areas. So we're hoping to implement both of those this year. The timeline's still being worked out, but that's where we're headed. And I don't know how we're doing on time. Okay. Yeah, we could have a few questions, and then I would like to talk about bats a little bit. So Not at this time. The goal in the EA is to have less than 200. And so after we get to that point, we're going to talk with the Forest Service and the Game and Fish about what the long-term future is, whether they would be back at House Rock Valley permanently, or they would be allowed to roam on the Kaibab. That still remains to be determined. The BLM was invited to be part of the EA, and they know about it, but they basically didn't want to have anything to do with bison on their land at this time, mainly because of the concerns around the cattle allotments and the other activities they have going on there. So it was considered in the EA, the environmental analysis, and wolves, a pack of wolves would kill bison, but we're trying to reduce this population in 3 to 5 years. I didn't mention that. We're trying to do it really quickly, and the wolves would not do it that quickly. They would have a benefit of probably moving the bison around on the landscape, but getting the numbers down, you'd have to have a lot of packs of wolves around. The park, Grand Canyon, isn't currently involved with any reintroduction efforts with Mexican gray wolves or gray wolves from the north. And so it was considered, but dismissed because it wasn't practical for reducing the population quickly. That was considered too, and there's a few examples of that, one in particular at Santa Catalina Island in California with bison on private land. But there's a kind of a checklist of things that need to be in place for that to happen. And one of them is kind of a captive population situation where you can get your hands on all of them. And currently we can't do that. And again, it wouldn't reduce the population in 3 to 5 years. It would basically stop, it has the potential to stop where we're at, but we still have 500 to 600 bison on the North Rim impacting the soil and the water and the vegetation and the arc sites. They still have cattle genes in them. We haven't tested them recently, but there's been work done in the past, and there's no reason to think they've changed because it's the same population, but they do have cattle genes within them. They typically aren't expressed as different colorations or anything like that, so